All right, I am back once again with yet another lens review. This time it's going to be the Nikon 50mm f1.4. I bet you thought I was never getting to it, but here I am. So a little backstory, I bought this lens about a year ago, almost exactly. I was going to see my family down in Florida, and I found it at a little thrift shop. It was attached to the Nikon S, which I mentioned in another video. They were both in bad condition, so I got them for like 40 bucks. The camera, the shutter was shot, so I sent it off for repairs, and there's a whole other video where I kind of talk about that. The lens it looked nice, but it had some sort of hazy stuff in it. But I went ahead and bought it, and I was actually able to open it up and clean out all the haze. I used it a little bit with the haze in it because it was mild enough. I thought the lens would be usable. And I actually have some of the photos from that era, and they seem to be just fine. So when I got it home, I ended up opening it up and cleaning out the sort of hazy stuff inside, which turned out to be, I guess, just oil that had kind of evaporated and stuck to the forward element. It was very easy to take it apart and put it back together, so that's good news right there. I might need to open it up once again and kind of clean off the aperture blades because it does seem like there's a tiny bit of oil on it. I don't remember if I cleaned those when I opened it the first time or not, but looking at it in preparation for this review, that seemed like something I might need to do. So I've shot this on both color film and black and white film, and I gotta say, all in all, you know, I hate to get right to it and just give it all away in the first minute of the video, but it's pretty comparable to the 50mm f2. I usually hail the 50mm f2 as being a superior lens, but realistically looking at them and really analyzing the images, I have to say the two of them are very, very, very comparable. Obviously the 51.4, you're going to get a little bit more depth of field and a little bit more low light, well, quite a bit more low light performance when it's wide open. But the reality is, if you're using it on an older Nikon rangefinder, or really I would argue most cameras in general, you're probably not going to shoot wide open all that often. So that extra stopper, so you get going from f2 to f1.4, is not generally going to be a big deal. It's not really going to be a make or break thing in most scenarios. It's not going to come into play. But that being said, I do like the lens when it's more closed down around, it's kind of hard to say. I'd say probably definitely at f5.6 down to the smaller apertures like f16, f22. The f2 version of the lens and the f1.4 are extremely comparable. When you start to open them up, you do notice some differences. The f2 is very sharp all the way open at f2, doesn't really have any sort of issues. There isn't really even vignetting. The images are sharp the whole way across. When you look at the 50mm f1.4 wider open at like f2.8 and definitely at f2 and f1.4, you do see that it doesn't have quite the same image quality. The center sharpness is very good. I've noticed the corner sharpness is not especially good. It's not horrible, but it's not great. It is noticeable in some images that it is kind of dull in the corners, I guess would be the best way to put it. It does also seem to suffer from just a little bit of vignetting, but again, that really only seems to be when it's pretty wide open, and I really only notice it in shots where you can see like open sky. That's pretty much the only time I ever really saw any sort of vignetting when looking over the images, which it depends. I'm sure some people will not like that. I think some people will. I would say all these things are relatively subtle, and you really only see them when the lens is like pretty wide open. And I think some people will appreciate it because it does have a certain artistic quality to it. The lens has a great bokeh quality. I wouldn't say it's absolutely perfect, but it is definitely on par with all the other Nikon lenses, and it's a little bit easier to produce when the lens is wide open, so that's very nice. It's hard to say where else to go with this lens. I know a lot of people really like the 51.4, but I do think there is something important and noteworthy in that designation. There are a couple of different models of 50mm f1.4, and as you can probably tell, mine is an early one. It came in a Nikon S, the first production Nikon camera, so it's going to be the earlier model. Apparently Nikon changed it a couple of times because they weren't too happy with the overall image results. I guess they were very happy with the early 50mm f1.5 lenses, which are quite rare, but not so much with the later lenses. And I believe what happened is they just kind of changed the formula a couple of times and didn't really advertise it too much, but if you really look, you can kind of spot the differences, and apparently there are differences in the serial number too, so for collectors, it's a pretty easy difference to spot. There are some other notable differences. There's the later lens, which is probably the most famous one, the extended barrel, sometimes called the Olympic lens because it was, I believe, exclusively sold on a special edition black Nikon S3 that was some sort of tie-in with the Olympics. I don't think it was sold at the Olympics, but it was something released around the time of the Olympics, and I think Nikon was like the sponsored camera company for the Olympics the year it came out in like 64, I want to say, but I can't quite remember. That is a pretty different lens overall in formula, and it's supposed to have much higher image quality, but they're rare and they're very expensive. Now, incidentally, the same lens was also released on the special edition 2000 Nikon S3. So that first run of the Olympic lenses was pretty rare. I think they only made a couple of thousand of them. The second run was a lot more common. They made at least 8,000 of them. So the later ones were a lot easier to find. But again, there are differences. The original ones were single-coated and the later ones were multi-coated. So when you add all that together, there's quite a few versions of the Nikon 50mm f1.4 lens. I don't know exactly how many kind of standard production lenses there were. Like I said, there's the early one I have that seems to have kind of poor corner sharpness and a little bit of vignetting, and I think there's later versions that are a little bit better. I think there's at least two later versions. There's sort of an intermittent one and then a later one, and then you have the rare Olympic one that came last, but I don't know too much about it. It's kind of hard to find a reference to it because apparently Nikon didn't really widely admit they were doing this. It's just something that collectors have picked up on. There are ways to spot it, like I said, aside from the serial number. Apparently the style of the lens, the little Ford, I don't know what it's called, but the little screw-on thing that kind of holds the lens together at the front can vary in its design some, and I think the lenses can also vary in length just by a tiny bit, only a millimeter or so, maybe even a little less than a millimeter, but if you have a few of them and you line them up, you might be able to notice there are some subtle differences there. I think another big difference is the early ones were pretty much all chrome, and the later ones were pretty much all black. So that might be another thing you could use to determine that, but that's not always 100% because Nikon like to go back and forth and have a lot of things in both black and chrome at the same time. You find some pretty late production stuff that was made in chrome. I mean, for instance, the S4s were only made in chrome, whereas later production S3s and SPs were very often black. So you do see differences with 35mm lenses too. Some of them are black, some are chrome, and it doesn't really seem to be, there doesn't seem to be too much rhyme or reason as to which is which. So all in all, I gotta say I like this lens. Looking at the images, it was a little bit better than I thought. I didn't think it was quite as sharp as the 50 f2, but I'd say on the whole, the sharpness is very comparable on the two of them. I would say for a beginner or anybody on a budget, the f2 version of the lens is still probably a little bit better. It's quite a bit cheaper, and I think it's extremely usable at every aperture rating, whereas if you go with the f1.4s, you don't know what you're getting. You don't know if you're getting one of the early ones or one of the later ones, so it's kind of hard to say exactly what quality you'll get. You should get passable quality, but I think you should also remember that you probably don't want to rely on shooting this lens wide open all the time because you are going to have more issues like possible vignetting and lack of corner sharpness. And I just think it's also tricky when you have lenses wide open, the actual field of focus is very narrow. So if your focus is off by just a little bit, the image is going to look out of focus. And that's just something that I think a lot of people are kind of vaguely aware of, but they don't really keep track of it, and they don't really actively think about that when they're shooting, and then they get back and their images aren't really that great, and yeah, there's not really much you can do about it after the fact. So it's just something to keep in mind that you probably don't need the 50mm f1.4. I know some people will hate me for saying that, but it's a really tough call. I think in most situations I would probably prefer the 50mm f2, but I will admit, after looking at the images, I did like the style that you get from the 51.4, the little hint of vignetting, the lack of corner sharpness, the dramatic depth of field, and I could see that being a very good lens for portrait work. Even then, I would say be careful and probably don't shoot with it wide open all the time. Make sure you shoot a couple of shots at like f2.8 or f4, then open it up and shoot more at like f2 or f1.4. Again, it depends on your applications. I think it's similar to the different types of cameras. You know, I have the S2, you have the SP. They're different cameras. Both of them have different features, and different people prefer different ones. And I think for different applications, each camera is usable. And I think it's kind of the same with these lenses. So that's pretty much the end of this here. I know it's kind of a short review for this lens that I've hyped up for a long time, but I gotta say, at the end of the day, it is pretty comparable to the 50mm f2. It's pretty comparable to later Nikon 50mm lenses that were made in f-mount. It's not a bad lens. It's actually quite nice. Again, it has a nice artistic style, I guess you could say. But I will say it's probably not for everybody. I think some people will prefer the 50 f2. I think if you have the money, a lot of people would rather have that later Olympic version with the extended barrel and the better image quality. I'd love to have that one, but like I said, they're pretty rare and expensive, so I'll just keep that on the wish list and maybe pick it up later. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and hopefully it was a nice, relatively short summary of a lens I've hyped for a long time that a lot of people love, and I actually kind of have a little place for in my heart. And I think I'm going to use this lens at least a little bit more because it just looks nice.